the unofficial town historian being Eric Potter, whose family has been in town for something crazy like 11 generations.
Now, have some of the historical documents and things in the town of Effingham burned?
Yeah, oh yeah.
They had a fire too.
There have been, find me a town that hasn't.
Right.
Yeah, there have been fires over the years.
Right.
But so this is the Davis Meeting House and Davis Meeting House Cemetery. This is actually the third of these cemetery talks that I've done under the auspices of or the purview of the Effingham Public Library. We've done the Center Effingham Church and the Effingham Falls Cemetery, and now this one. It's a nice fall activity. Fits in well with Halloween. Do want to mention the library, currently undergoing renovations, but in a few, cross fingers, short weeks, will be reopened with gorgeous new floors and walls and ceilings and all of that. Cross fingers. As you know, with probably any construction project, things don't always go the way you thought they were gonna.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. And want to thank Effingham, New Hampshire Connect, who own the property, for letting us come in and tour it. It is technically private property, so we do technically have to have permission, which they were nice enough to give. And also want to mention that all of this information didn't just magically come out of my brain. I'm building on information from several different sources. The Effingham Historical Society back in the 1970s had a cemeteries committee that went around and researched a lot of the cemeteries. That research was built upon in the late 80s and early 90s by a couple by the name of George and Maxine Pearson, who did an updated book, which they went through, and they were very methodical. All the dates, all the inscriptions on tombstones, the whole 9 yards. There's a history of Carroll County that was originally published in, I believe it's 1891 by a woman by the name of Georgia Drew Merrill. Some of the information came from that. And then notes from different people over the years that have been scribbled in the margins of some of these various different things. This cemetery in particular, I counted in the book. In the book, there are 341 listed graves, but there are some plots that they just don't know. There's no markers, there's no information. And there have been some burials since the book was done in 1991. So at this point, easily over 350 graves, or at least memorials, in the cemetery. This cemetery is particularly rich in statuary and engravings. A lot of the stones have really nice engravings on them. And unfortunately it's gone, although there was a photograph of it, luckily. But the Kennett obelisk there, right there, used to have an angel on the top of it. Had wings and the whole 9 yards. And if you look at it closer, you can see where the little piece of metal sticks up, the little piece of rebar where the angel used to mount to the top. And there's also on a lot of the stones here a lot of funerary poems. This is not Wordsworth level stuff here. Some of them it's like, ouch, like that rhyme, yeah, I guess it works if you pronounce things a little off. But some of them are kind of fun to read.
Any recipes?
No recipes, no. So that's the general overview. We'll talk about the building a little bit later because the folks from Effingham Connect have been nice enough to open the building so that we can go in and take a look around inside after. And there's, as I understand it, some treats and some mulled apple cider for everyone to enjoy at the end. So, come on in. We're going to go over here first.
Let's see.
This is the Davis Center.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And I will say, watch your footing. There are holes and soft spots and all of that sort of thing. So this is the Davis section of the Davis Cemetery. And just for your perspective, if you go back about you got a couple of flags in a row there, and then that row that sort of goes over behind the building itself. All the way up to that and across is all the Davis family section of the cemetery. The Davis family alone accounts for 58 graves in this cemetery, which is like something like 17% of all the graves in the cemetery are the Davis family. And some of them are relatively recent. There's graves in here from the 21st century, from 2008, 2009.
2017 was the most recent Davis buried there.
Oh, okay. This one here, though, is Elder Joseph B. Davis, who was the original Davis, but elder. Yeah. He was in the 1820s. There's this sort of religious movement, which led to a lot of Baptist churches, Free Will Baptist churches. This one was the first in Effingham. Elder Davis was ordained on the 1st of July of 1824. The church was formed in 1825 prior to them having a building, which wasn't uncommon. A lot of times the churches would be formed, everybody get together and we're going to start a church. And then you take the next steps to get a piece of land, build a building, that sort of thing. Elder Davis was the first pastor of the Davis Meeting House, or what was technically the first Free Will Baptist Church in Effingham. Just for reference, the second Free Will Baptist Church was on Lord's Hill. The third Free Will Baptist Church was in Effingham Falls, and then there was the Calvin Baptist Church, which was in Center Effingham. And the Baptist...
They force all of that Calvins to come.
And the Baptist movement actually was what led to essentially the breaking up of the original town of Effingham. Most of the settlers on the southern part of Effingham, everything below the Osprey, were mainly Congregationalists who came up from the Hampton area. Most of the people who settled in North Effingham, now Freedom, north of the Osprey River, came over from Portland, Maine. And they were early folks in this new religious movement. In those days, there was one bridge across the river. It was Isaac Lord's Toll Bridge, which was near where the farm by the river is now, if you know where the farm by the river is on 153. And in those days, you had to go to church. And you had to go to the church. Now, keep in mind, this is after the Revolutionary War, so technically we have separation of church and state. But you had to go to church, and if you didn't, you were fined. And the church you had to attend was the Congregational one in Morris Hill. That was the church. To get to it, if you lived north of the river, you had to pay a toll. So if you went, it cost you money. If you didn't go, it cost you money. And either way, and if you did go, you're sitting in a church service that maybe religiously isn't something you necessarily agree with. That there was a town. Yep, they actually had an elected town officer then whose job was to go around and knock on your door if they didn't see you. And knock on your door on Monday if they didn't see you at church on Sunday and go, yeah. So obviously that led to a lot of disagreements. They tried to solve it in 1820. Isaac Lord sells his bridge to the town for $750, and also provides a bell for the church. It's the Paul Revere bell in the Lord's Hill Meeting House. And the bridge becomes free. But by then, it's kind of too late. There's enough animosity by then, you're already into the 1820s, that in 1831, North Effingham goes, yeah, we're done. And they break off. They're North Effingham for a year, and then they change their name and they become Freedom. This gentleman would have been part of that movement of folks who were going, well, wait a minute, I don't agree with what they're preaching over in the Congregational Church at Lord's Hill. I have a different outlook religiously, and that's where you start to see these Free Will Baptist churches crop up. And like I said, 3 of them in the town of Effingham alone. Keep in mind, in those days, traveling from here to Effingham Falls was a big deal. You know, everybody was more village oriented. So if you look at the villages, they all had a church, they all had a school. There were general stores much more frequently. At one point, Effingham had 5 post offices because every village had one. You didn't go as far. I've seen postcards where somebody in South Effingham mails a postcard to somebody in Center Effingham because going to see them was, you know, that was a day's walk. That's kind of far to go, you know. So anyway, so Joseph Davis, first pastor of the church, and like I said, ordained in 1824. He's one of at least 5 original church members who are actually buried in this church. His wife being one of them. There's another couple elsewhere in the cemetery. So, as you can see, the very imposing arch was installed later. It's got I think a date on it of 1880, I think. But obviously as they expanded, they wanted something a little more imposing than. No, these aren't. These are actually. Given that he died in 1843, it's not. The stones are in very good condition. So, and that's again another one of those examples of those funerary poems that they engraved. The other thing that boggles my mind is that you look at how they do stone engraving now, and they've got all this equipment and machinery and all of that sort of thing. This would have all been done by hand in those days. Which is kind of amazing. Any questions? Otherwise, we're going to go back up to the center aisle and up.
The Davis family, are they, in essence, based in Freedom?
No, they were based, well,
Actually,
kind of all over. There's a farm down the road that was
Oh,
the
yes,
Davis farm.
yes.
Are there any Davises left in town at this point?
Janet's mother lives up there, and she's
Probably
the
connected.
Davis.
Yeah. No, most of the main Davises over in Maine now, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We're scattered around.
the mother
Yeah.
is.
So my uncle, who is the last surviving Kenneth, his son is living in the Davis house now,
Oh, okay.
even though he carries the Douglas name.
Gotcha. Really? There's a Douglas in here.
And that's, yep. That's his
Are you
relative.
talking about Pat Parsons? No. Her maiden name was no. It began with a U.
But she's not the
No, ma'am, she's not. No, we were gifted the building directly by the Davis family themselves.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. I don't know.
Yeah.
Somebody told me the wrong story.
That's okay. Fritz Weatherby says never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah, the Davis family that was in Maine was the one that gifted.
All right. Center aisle.
It starts with you,
And a lace here. This is the, as far as I can tell, oldest grave, and I put that in quotes, because it says she died in 1811, which is a good 13 years before Elder Davis is ordained, 14 years before the church is formed, and 22 years before the building is built. It's possible the cemetery was here first. There were sort of community cemeteries. But the only reason I find it unlikely is given how far back we are. Usually they started at the front and they sort of built in this way. My guess is that either A, it's just a stone. She was buried elsewhere, but they wanted to put a stone up so that there'd be a stone for her in the family plot. Or they could have moved the grave. Uncommon at that period of time, but not unheard of. It was possible. Or, like I said, that the cemetery predates the building. That I don't know. But this is the oldest death date in the cemetery, October 24th, 1811. So, now,
Eric, is it unorthodox for me to offer information? Sure. As you hear things. So it is possible that was here before the building.
yeah,
The Davises and the Tuttles were related,
right.
and there is a Tuttle cemetery behind Jack Russell's house, up on the side of the mountain. It's a beautiful little cemetery. The burials in there predate the 1700s. So it is possible that they are connected, and this may have been a farm either side of this, and that's why that is there. But that, yeah, there are some Tuttles
Yeah,
here as well.
there are
Yep.
some Tuttles
The
here.
Tuttles and the Davises were related.
That was Mary Tuttle. And they were from the Durham area.
All right. John Marston, which it is engraved on the stone if you catch it in the right light. He was killed in action at the Battle of Wilderness, Virginia, on the second day of that battle during the Civil War. The only veteran grave in here that I can find where the person actually died during the war that was killed in action. All the rest passed away later. Although there was one other Civil War veteran who died so soon after the Civil War ended that I tend to wonder if it wasn't because of wounds received during the battle or something like that. I did go through and count because I was curious, and there are 28 veteran graves in this cemetery. 3 from the American Revolution, 1 from the War of 1812, 10 from the Civil War, 1 that it's unclear whether they were a Civil War veteran or a Spanish-American War veteran. Based on their age, they could have been either. 1 from World War I, 8 from World War II, 2 from Korea, and 2 from Vietnam. So, almost, with the possible exception of the Spanish-American War, every conflict up through basically modern, the Gulf Wars and beyond, which I thought was fascinating to have such a wide breadth of veteran graves. They are all marked with the flags and the markers. That's done by the town. They do that all over town. All of the known veteran graves are marked each spring with a flag and the little. Some of them have the older ones. This one here is actually an old cast iron Grand Army of the Republic marker. The more modern day ones, unfortunately, because of the cost nowadays, they're plastic.
Do they put wreaths on the person's hand, like wreaths across America?
No, that's usually done at some of the bigger cemeteries. I know they do that at the Veterans Cemetery in Boscawen.
Right,
the
but we're
state
starting
one.
to do it in cities
Right,
now. And I
right.
was wondering
Yeah.
if they start.
I mean, I'm sure if somebody reached out, that part of the problem in Effingham is the veterans' graves. They're literally spread out all over town. I mean, it's a big enterprise.
But
Not
this one's
that it's not
private,
worth
so
doing.
you
Right.
couldn't-
Not that it's not worth doing, but I mean, it would literally take you with a crew of people all day long to do it. There's a couple of guys who go around over the course of probably a week to do the flags because you have to drive all over town. A lot of the veteran graves are in private cemeteries, at someone's home and all of that sort of thing. So it's a drive around and put them in. Chris used to do it. You used to do that with your dad, didn't you?
We actually went with the 2 remaining, my entire childhood, Davises that I knew were Kenny and Frank. And for many, many years, they were the ones that put the flags out. And that's been carried down to Greg, who is Kenny's son, correct? Yep.
Yes.
And Greg is a veteran as well, and a member of Effingham Connect, and Effingham resident Timothy Murphy does it with him, so they're carrying on that tradition.
There is one flag in here that's not on a veteran grave. We'll get to that one in a minute. It's actually on the grave of 3 women who were daughters of a Revolutionary War soldier. So because they were daughters of a Revolutionary War soldier. It's interesting, the inscription says real daughters of a Revolutionary War soldier versus the fake ones.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people try to get into the DAR.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
figure.
Yeah. And they were all members of the Betsy Ross chapter of the DAR, which probably had something to do with it. So, yeah.
Provide your papers.
Oh, yeah. Francis Granville, who died in 1837 at the age of 90. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. And this is a really good example of, I was saying a lot of them have really pretty engraving or on the tombs, on the grave markers themselves. This is a really good example of that. So yeah, he was a captain, died on the 24th of October of 1837.
What's the second one? October 24th.
Yeah, I noticed that too when I was like, wait a minute, did I copy that over wrong? And I went back and looked, and I was like, no, that's just a really odd coincidence. And very close date-wise to today.
That's why I looked at my watch. Today's the 22nd.
No, you're not imagining that. All right. So we've talked about that we have 28 veteran graves. As I said, there are 58 Davises. The second highest type of grave, not the veterans, children. Until relatively recently, 25% of children died before they were 1, 50% before they were considered adults, which is at about 15. In this cemetery, based on the papers that I have, 9 graves for under the age of 18 was basically where I cut it off. I said, we'll do 18 as our magic number. This one, I think, although there's one other that's possible, is the youngest. Baby Ruth was only 3 days old. The only other one that's a possible is there's a Douglas grave, and it's got the husband, and then it's got his wife, and it says Diana, I think it's Diana Douglas, and infant son. And it doesn't give any name or dates for the infant son, which could mean that they died during childbirth, which would make that infant son even shorter lived than poor little baby Ruth here. But not uncommon. Again, the children's graves represent 14% of the burials in this cemetery. Was pretty common during that time period. I remember my grandmother telling me a story about how her father was one of 14 children. And they had so many kids, particularly if they were farmers, because they needed the workforce. And the assumption was they'd lose half of them. My great-great-grandmother had 14 children. She only lost 2. So then they had the opposite problem. They had more kids than they knew what to do with. Which was why my great-grandfather actually had the ability to go to college, because they had plenty of kids to work the farm, so he got to stay in school, which was also unusual for that time. So. All right. And then right behind, interestingly enough, Baby Ruth, we have the Kate plot, and buried in the Kate plot is one of the Kate sisters, Lydia. Lydia Dearborn is the oldest burial. It's engraved on the side. When Lydia passed away on the 25th of June of 1901, she was 99 years, 5 months, and 19 days old. And like I said, she and her sisters were members of the Betsy Ross DAR, and it says it, I believe, on this side is where it's engraved. One of the sides has the real daughters of the Revolution. It's not on there. Maybe it was on the marker originally. But so Lydia, who's engraved on the other side, one of them, her sisters, was Clara Helen, who died at Fort Monroe, Virginia in 1863, and then Alice Ives was the other sister. So they were all Kates. But Lydia holds the distinction of being the oldest resident of the cemetery, almost 100 years ago. Farther up, this one is kind of a favorite, kind of fun.
Oh, that's good.
least 350. Yeah, when I counted in the cemetery book, which only goes up to 1991, I got 341. I was able to find at least 7 additional burials since then, just looking at stones. And it doesn't account for some of these plots where there's a plot, but there's no record of whether there's any graves in it or not. This one, she earned the distinction, so she wanted to make sure everybody knew. Lydia Davis, who was the widow of Simeon Huntress and Thomas Abbott and the wife of Nathaniel Moody. She had 3 husbands, and she listed all 3 of them. Her husband Simeon unfortunately died when he was only 25. She was 24. Don't know about Thomas, but obviously young enough that she remarried again for a 3rd time. I just thought that was like, usually someone might be buried by a former spouse, but they usually don't have their headstone engraved with a rota of who all the husbands were, but, she was apparently proud of that, so good for her.
Well, she outlived them all.
No, I think Nathaniel might have outlived her just based on the fact that it says widow of Simeon and Thomas, but then it says and wife of Nathaniel. So I think Nathaniel outlived her. But she was buried. Sarah's her daughter, I think, just based on the dates. I'm guessing it was her daughter with her 2nd husband. Sarah was born in about 1850 when Lydia would have been about probably 30 years old. So. All right, and the next.
This medallion gives the information.
Oh, does it? Okay.
It says the real daughters of Revolutionary Soldiers, 1775 to 1783, directed by Betsy Ross Charity.
Yeah. All right. Up the hill. Warmer than I thought it was going to be. So I know a couple of folks were talking about Pat Parsons and Janet Bardowitz. This is a connection of theirs. This is a Gale family plot. Paul and Janet Bardowitz live in the Gale farm, which used to be up on the mountain. It was moved. And I believe Pat Parsons' mother was a Gale, I think is the connection, but I'm not positive. I know Pat's maiden name began with a U, but I think her mother was a Gale. Willis Gale, I know, was at one point was tax collector in the town of Effingham. And I was poking around on the internet not all that long back and found this and thought, oh, this is neat, and bought it, not even realizing I'd be doing this cemetery tour. And also on this stone are Daniel Gale and his wife Helen. Daniel died in 1914, Helen in 1929. This is a Christmas postcard sent in 1909 to Mrs. Daniel Gale, Effingham, New Hampshire. So this postcard was sent to her. Which was kind of, my brain all of a sudden connected the two in the middle of the night about 3 days ago, and I went, wait a minute. So that was a kind of fun little find. Let's see, what else do we know about the Gales? Yeah, Willis was a tax collector. Paul and Janet lived in the Gale farm. Postcard, and then, like I said, I believe Pat Parsons' mother was a Gale, which is the connection. I think Daniel was Pat's granduncle or something like that. Willis, I think maybe was her uncle. That seems right date-wise. But
Is he a dairy farmer?
Willis?
Or is that a cow?
That's a no. I think that's a sheep. It's a lamb.
It's a lamb.
It's a lamb. Yeah. It's
Is that
for
a child cemetery?
yeah. It's their son Ernest. So I believe just based on dates, Willis was Daniel and Helen's son, as was Ernest. Ernest died at the age of 2. So that's a little lamb. All right. Now we're gonna go this way. So I talked about how there were all these different Free Will Baptist churches. They cropped up, for the most part, about the same time in the 1830s, early 1840s. This one has an interesting connection to one of those. This is Dearborn Davis. He and his wife Sarah had a daughter named Huldah. Huldah, who may have been a cousin to the man she married, also not uncommon in that time period, Huldah married a man by the name of John Demerit. John Demerit owned the sawmill in Effingham Falls that used to be at the head of the Ossipee River, where the dam is now. And when he was the agent for the Saco Water Power Company, he was the man in 1878 and 79 who arranged for the canal to be dug. If you've ever gone down to the dam on Ironworks Road in Effingham Falls, you pull into the parking area and you've got the first part of the dam, and there's a waterway, and then you've got the island, and then you've got another chunk, and there's another dam section there. That second dam section is the part that, if you drove down 153 at all, particularly in the mornings over the past couple of years, there were a lot of cement trucks going up the private road there because that chunk was completely rebuilt. That first chunk of waterway didn't originally exist. They dug that whole thing. The channel is about 20, it's a canal, and it was meant to power the waterway. That first part of the dam, I can remember when it was still owned by Central Maine Power, and they used it to generate hydroelectric. And that dam's been used for power generation. They would generate the electricity at the dam there to power the mills that were down floating in the river where the bridge is now. If you look at old postcards, there were, and you can actually still see sort of where some of them were. If you stand on the bridge and look to the sides, you can see where they cut into the hill, and there were mills sitting, essentially floating on the water, originally powered by wheels directly underneath them. But as electricity became more of a thing, what they started doing, the mills still operated where they sat, but what they did was they used electric that was generated up at the dam house at the top of the canal in the 1870s. So kind of interesting that these folks, their daughter, married a man who was one of the founders about 10 years after this one of the Free Will Baptist Church down in Effingham Falls, which is right next door to my house. So, then we're not going to get the stone way over in the corner that has flowers. That is the Bailey Keniston stone. And Cindy, I'm sure will remember, Chris, I'm sure will remember Myrtle Keniston, who, a couple of things that I always thought were neat. I found something once. Myrtle Keniston served as the supervisor of the checklist for the town for more than 3 decades continuously. Which I thought was mind-boggling. The other thing that Myrtle did that I thought was always, as a kid, thought was like magic. She embroidered stationery. So she would take paper and embroidery floss, and she would little flowers and things like that. And I remember my mother having some of her stationery as a kid. Myrtle was a member of both the Historical Society and the Effingham Grange, and I think it's probably something that was sort of a Grange thing. That was sort of kind of fell into their auspices. Myrtle unfortunately passed away. She was in a very bad car accident in the 80s, and after she passed, the Effingham Historical Society hands out 2 scholarships every year. One of those is usually handed out in Myrtle's name. She was a very sweet lady.
She was a school bus driver.
Yep.
Yeah, for station wagon.
Yep.
I think. Yeah.
I remember hearing that. Yeah, she drove this, and she actually used to live just across
Yep.
the street here. The Cragans knew her very well. She and her husband had no children, or had no children that lived, maybe would be the better way of it. So that's the Bailey Kenniston plot, and then there's another Kenniston plot that's like her in-laws right next to it. So,
I think, and this could be hearsay, but I think George Kenniston was born in our house on Green Mountain Road across from
Okay.
Bruce. Very good.
that wouldn't surprise me. My father was born at home.
Yeah, they're all.
He
Yeah.
was the fifth kid. He was ready to be in the world. There he was. All right, and the last one, we're going to sort of head down the hill here. I mentioned the Cragans. That's the Cragan family plot right there, who live obviously just up the road, because the draft horses, if you want to. There's nothing written on it. It looks like there is, but there's not. It's like the mirror image of something. Yeah. Trust me, I was like this close to it the other day, going, "What does that say? What does that say?" So these two are interesting. I was saying that I got some of the information for this from the History of Carroll County by Georgia Drew Merrill, and each town in the county, there's a section in the book on that town. And one of the things that she talks about was, notable physicians from the town or other noteworthy people from the town. Most of the town sections have a biographical sketch of some particularly noteworthy individual. But one of the things she noted in the Effingham section was that Effingham had someone who had been born in Effingham and grown up in Effingham who had become sheriff for Carroll County. That was Andrew Milliken. These are his parents, Thomas and Mary. He was born in Effingham, ended up living in Wakefield in the latter part of his life, but he served as the sheriff of Carroll County from 1883 to 1889. Prior to that, he'd been the deputy sheriff for 9 years. He also served in the State House of Representatives for a couple of years during the Civil War. He was an Effingham selectman in the late 1850s and early 1860s, and served as the clerk I'm assuming they mean town clerk, in Wakefield, and ended up as the, now it escapes me. Something else in Wakefield. The postmaster in Wakefield Corner in 1889. And Andrew died in 1907. But an Effingham kid, county sheriff, look at that. Chris is grimacing in back.
Grandpa was constable in the town 38 years.
That's true. Yeah. So that's the ones that I sort of picked. There are tons of other interesting, like I said, a lot of poems on the stones, things like that, that are interesting to look at, but you can't talk about all of them. As I said, there's 350. We'd be here for weeks. If anybody has any questions, I will do my best to answer them. I don't know everything about everything. So.
Would you say, my family has a plot up here, and so, it's getting a little crowded, but would you say this cemetery is pretty much at its max, or how is
I'm getting a no from the back.
So
I think it depends on the plot.
So I'm going to let Deb take over. She's a Davis. She
okay.
does actually have the plots, the plot maps and the names of all of the residents. Here.
I was always told that it was at its fullest. And so anybody that was finally buried towards the end was possibly cremated. But other than that, I've always been led to believe that it was at its fullest, and they had tried at one time to expand onto other properties, but at that time it fell through.
And the, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
And the reason why I shook my head no is, according to the maps and according to everything we found, and obviously we will do our due diligence to make sure, because we have, believe it or not, had people express an interest in here. The best we can tell, that where the beech tree is, there's two small beech trees that are being illuminated by the sun right now. From there back to the fence, there is, as far as we know, nothing. As I said to Deb when she first came in, one of the reasons why I really want to research it, if you look over the bank over there, there are two bases like this, and with busted off headstones just pitched over the bank. We obviously have to find out where those belong. Are they replacements? Did they get broken and they just bought all new stones? Or do they belong over there, and who do they belong to? As a child, as Eric said earlier, I took care of the cemeteries for many, many years with my father. That little placard right there, that had a cue card that would get put in it. Not every year, but every couple of years, the family members would come and freshen that up. You can clearly see by the indentations that there are people interred there, most likely in a wooden casket. That's why the ground caves in, because unfortunately gravity takes over. So we have to fill those in. There are several like that in the cemetery that we have to. But if we can find that there is additional space, there is actually plot markers, which are these, your corner markers. There are corner markers that are just down over that hill on this side. I have not been able to find any on the other side. So were they plot markers that got overlooked? Were they got plot markers that got replaced? As you can see, some of them are very nice marble and granite that is polished, and some of them are just rough granite. So it is possible that somebody came in and updated them at some point in time. Unfortunately, despite the fact that it is private property now, things do happen. People do come in. One of the things that Cindy and I noticed today as we were walking around is the lippets. There's a footstone over there with a pumpkin that 2 days ago had not been disturbed. And you can see from here that the stone has been pulled up, the soil has been turned over. Very curious to why that is. We have no idea. We don't know if, it appears that somebody was buried there, possibly an urn, but we have no idea. So we'll be checking with the Board of Selectmen, but thanks to New Hampshire Chronicles, and the reason why we were able to successfully locate the oldest cemetery, what we believe to be the oldest cemetery in town, is the Poor Farm on Moody Road. There is a gentleman in Newport, New Hampshire, that does ultrasound, and can find bones and remnants of caskets and things of that nature. It was on Chronicles. And he was doing a job for the town of Ospey at that time. So we said, hey, you're right there in Ospey. We know you're extremely, expensive. Could we talk? And he assured us that that was indeed a very impressive, his words, very old cemetery that has no markers outside of wolf stones. In the many hundreds of years ago, there were many wolves in this area. And it's a granite state. You didn't have the equipment to dig very deep, whatever, so you may not necessarily have been able to go down 6 feet. And you had to, because if you didn't, unfortunately, your loved one that you interred was probably going to get dug up by a wild animal, most likely a wolf. So they piled rocks up over them. And depending on the height of the rock was how far they were able to go down, is what he said. So the higher the pile of rocks, that means they hit a piece of ledge or something, and they had to pile up the rocks. And as we stood on the wall with that gentleman and looked, you could see they were all very symmetrical wolf stones in that cemetery. So I said all that because I would like to get in contact with that gentleman. We talked about it a little bit and have him come and do the same thing in that section. Sections like where Cindy is standing, to really truthfully identify where the folks are. You can have maps, but we all know that unfortunately things do happen. And I don't know if you were done, Eric, but one interesting fact that Deb actually brought to my attention, we had a dinner here a month ago now almost. There are 2 headstones that match in the front rows, front sections. They're identical.
One of them says my grandfather was married to an Emma, and he was not. That was his nephew's wife. And because they shared a name, it's the only reason why we can think of that somebody placed a stone. But my grandfather was a stonemason, so we're not sure why. When my grandfather, Joseph, next to Elder Joseph, when his wife died, it was my understanding she died in 1909. I still can't find her death certificate. I believe she is the one that's actually buried there. Her name is Henrietta. And his nephew is right behind him, and that's where the other Emma is, and she is truly the one that belongs with the nephew.
The other thing, and I can't remember which one it was now, and this wasn't uncommon either. I know of at least one other a cemetery in Freedom that has the same thing. You had father, John Doe, has a son, John Doe Jr. John Doe Jr. dies. They have another son, John Doe Jr. So you can have one family, I know of a circumstance, 3 sons, all named for the father. It's a genealogist's nightmare because you're going, wait a minute, how can there be 3 juniors? You know, and what it was is if you look at the dates very carefully, the first one passed, the child dies, they have another son, they name the son for the father. The child dies, they have another son, they name the son for the father. There's at least one example in here where I'm pretty sure that that's what happened, is you've got 2 sons with the same name because one of them passed away and they had another son and wanted to name the son for the father.
Before you leave, we'll take a look. Emma, the only difference in the stones is one was the wife of Joseph B., and one was just the wife of Joseph. Emma died in 1806. Well, we'll look at the dates, but it's the exact same information outside of the B.
Right.
So it's very interesting.
Yeah. I know of at least, I know when the Thurston home went up for sale in Effingham Falls, they had the estate sale. It was a gravestone in the barn. And I know of somebody who pulled up the front stoop to their house and found this gorgeous granite stoop and never realized what it was when they were remodeling the house and they needed to fix the front stoop. And they pulled the piece of granite out to move it to the side and realized that it was a gravestone that had been flipped over.
Can I tell you an interesting gravestone story? I like to tell stories just like Eric does. I work for the town of Ospey Highway Department, and one of our grader operators is a gentleman named Timothy Eldridge. And we were on Circuit Road in the Simon Hill area of Ospey, just into the Ospey from Effingham's town line. Grading much like he always has, was cutting a little deeper, maybe with erosion and things of that. It was certainly still within the roadbed, and he rolled up a big flat stone, and we all got out and started digging it and said, "You need to stop." It was a headstone. On my father's grave, the name on the stone was Timothy Eldridge. And there was no sign of a cemetery within. There was a cemetery, but it wasn't that close to where we were, so it was probably a quarter of a mile away. But that stone got turned over to the state of New Hampshire. But just an interesting thing to add to how headstones do get removed and moved, and unfortunately we do have vandals that do horrible things. So
Not as common up here, but I know my aunt lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and they would have cases where, lost at sea, put up a gravestone.
there hasn't.
10 years later,
Knock on
they walk in the front door. Oh, well, then take down the gravestone.
honestly,
They get stranded on an island or something, and it took them years to make it home. And
Are cemeteries considered private property? Or are they?
depends on the cemetery.
Depends on the cemetery.
In Effingham, there's only one that's public, and that's the one on Woodlawn Cemetery on Hobbs Road. All the rest of them are technically private. in the sense that they are on private property.
Like this one, for instance.
Right. Now, as I said, under state law, there's a right of access. So, for example, if you were a descendant of the Gales, you have, under the law, the right to come in and tend to your plot, whether that's place flowers or have the stone cleaned or, what have you. Like Chris was saying, that you can see there where the graves have obviously settled. That's sometimes what leads to the stones to tip. Because if it's truly a headstone, which is the other thing that's interesting about this cemetery, a lot of the headstones are at their feet. The graves are behind them.
Like those guys.
Yeah, like these right here. You're probably standing on one.
Oh, so this
Just so
would
you
be
know.
the feet. And then
I think, yeah, if you look at how the stones are relative to where the plot is, like when we were down looking at Elder Davis's stone, the stone is at the very front. The grave is behind it.
Yeah.
Usually they're called headstones for a reason. Usually they're at the head, and the grave is in front of it. This cemetery, for whatever reason, and the only reason I can think is maybe because of the hilly nature of the plot, for whatever reason, the stones are at the front and the graves seem to be behind in most cases. Not all of them. Some of them, like, for example, the Cates that had the little, bump up, or the Drake one where Baby Ruth was, they've got a marker in the, an obelisk or something in the middle, and then there's probably graves around it. But for a lot of the plots, the graves are behind the stones. But a lot of times what will happen with headstones is as the grave settles, like those have, this happened at one of my family's plots and we had to have it fixed. You've got the stone, and then under the stone, like even under, you'll see the stone, and then you've got a base. There's usually another base underneath that. As the body decomposes, in a lot of cases, particularly around here, there are old pine boxes. In some cases, there may not be a box at all. It could just be in a shroud. That wasn't uncommon. As the grave settles, the base to the stone sinks. And that's when you start to get the stones tipping. And the problem is, as they tip, once they get too tipped over, the weight of the top of the stone, it can't handle, and it snaps. And that's when the stones snap off. You know what I mean? Usually, particularly if the stone, once the stone stays upright, usually they'll last a good long while. My great grandfather's headstone in Maryland still exists. It's slowly degrading over time because it's slate and it's chipping away as the elements get at it. But his stone dates to 1768. As long as they stay upright, because the elements don't get them as much, they're designed in a way almost to...
He's saying now with the flat stones, they sink right into the ground.
They do. And that's why, periodically, what you have to do is you have to go back and
Maybe that's what
pull 'em
they're
up.
doing over there.
possibly, yeah. It's funny, I'll have to go over and look because I was in here yesterday, and I
Yeah,
don't
so
recall
stone is
seeing
just
it.
sitting
I don't
on
recall
top.
seeing it. So...
But it's 2008 too. It's current.
Yeah.
Fairly
Yeah,
current.
it's a relatively, and like Chris said, it could be, my mother passed away this winter and she was just interred, she was a cremation, she was interred above another casket in a family plot,
Yeah.
and then we'll eventually have a stone placed, you know what I mean? But, and it's funny because different cemeteries have different rules on, it varies by state. I'd be interested to find out what New Hampshire's rules are as far as interment, and whether you can put cremations over caskets. Some places allow it, some don't. So. All right, well, like I said,